Chapter 10, The Great Stone Face 2. So before you read, many years passed. Ernest was now a man of middle age. So year passed and now Ernest has grown and he is now a middle aged man. So above 40, 45 you can say. To his neighbors, who never suspected that he was anything more than an ordinary and familiar face. Okay, so neighbors also they took him as an ordinary and familiar face. He was only a humble and hardworking, though thoughtful person. Okay, so he was a thoughtful person. He would think something, but he was humble and hardworking person. So never suspected that he was anything more than an ordinary face. So they never thought that he is something more than an ordinary face. So they also thought that he is ordinary face. It means that. But what about the old prophecy? But what happened to the old prophecy? The belief of the stone face, someone will come, we will resemble the stone face. So this was a prophecy. Was it ever fulfilled? Let us read and find out. The years hurried on and brought white hairs upon the head of Ernest and made wrinkles across his forehead and furrows in his cheeks. So he was getting old. So this is the sign of old age, that it will start with the wrinkles on the skin, hairs will turn white, okay, and cheeks will be furrows will be there in the cheeks as well and forehead as well. So he was getting old. He was an old man, okay, but not in vain had he grown old. More numerous than the white hairs on his head were the wise thoughts in his mind. So actually the white hairs also represent the experiences or the knowledge. So in his mind, so wise thoughts, like the good thoughts he carries in his mind, is represented by the white hair. Okay, it is said like that. And Ernest had ceased to be obscure. Unsought for undesired had come the fame which so many seek. Okay, so he got something which many seeks. So what is that? Will come. So he had become famous beyond the limit of the valley. Okay, so he had become famous, okay, beyond the limits of the valley. College professors and even the active men of cities came far to see and converse with Ernest, and he received them with gentle sincerity and spoke freely with them of whatever came uppermost or lay deepest in his heart or their own. Okay, so people will come to meet him from far places also, and he will meet him with very sincerity, okay, and spoke freely and nicely to them. So while they talked together, his face would brighten unawares and shine upon them as with a mild evening light. So they will be like cheered when they talk, they will be happy and glad. So while Ernest had been growing old, God had granted a new poet to this earth. Now he is a new poet. He too was a native of the valley, but had spent the greater part of his life in distant cities, pouring out his sweet music everywhere. So he was a poet, so he would write some poems and it was liked by most of the people. So neither was the great stone face forgotten, for the poet had celebrated it in a poem. So poet has written this about the great stone face in his poem also, and the great stone face was also not forgotten. One thing was the belief that was carried out from generation to generation, and second thing was this, the poet has also written about it in his poem. The songs of his poet found their way to Ernest. He read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. So he would write and he will see towards the mountain. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. So he read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. So the songs of this poet found their way to Ernest. So songs of this poet found their way to Ernest. What does this mean? So there were other poets who will read the poems of Ernest, and they will be pulled towards Ernest. Okay, they will find the way towards Ernest. He read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door, and he will read the poem also near his cottage door, and while he will read, he will see the mountain as well. "O great stone face," he said, "is not this man worthy to be your likeness?" Okay. "O great stone face," he said, "is not this man worthy to be your likeness?" Now the poet is saying, the who has visited, that this great stone face resembles you. It means that is not this man worthy to be your likeness. In this mountain face looks like you, it means. The face seemed to smile but did not answer. Now it happened that the poet thought he lived so far away, had not only heard the Ernest but had thought much about his character, and wished to meet this man whose wisdom walked hand in hand with the noble simplicity of his life. One summer day, therefore, he arrived at Ernest's door, where he found the good old man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and then, with a finger between the leaves, looked lovingly at the great stone face. Once again, see, the face seemed to smile but did not answer. Okay. Now it happened that the poet thought he lived so far away, had not only heard of Ernest but had thought much about his character, and wished to meet this man whose wisdom walked hand in hand with the noble simplicity of his life. So he was a fan of him. You can take it like that. That he read so much poems of him, and he wanted to meet him actually. So one summer day, therefore, he arrived at Ernest's door. So he finally visited Ernest, where he found the good old man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and then, with a finger between the leaves, looked lovingly at the great stone face. So he will read the book when he saw Ernest. Ernest was reading the book, and he will see the great stone face as well. "Good evening," said the poet. The poet wished him good evening. "Can you give a traveler a night's shelter?" So he wanted to stay there. So he requested for a shelter, night's shelter. "Gladly," answered Ernest. And then he added, smiling, "I think I never saw the great stone face looked so hospitably at a stranger." Okay, gladly answered Ernest, and then he added, smiling, "I think I never saw the great stone face looked so hospitably at a stranger." And great stone face was never so hospitable at the stranger. The poet sat down beside him, and he and Ernest talked together. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen too. He gazed into the poet's eyes. "Who are you, my gifted guest?" he asked. The poet laid his finger on the book that Ernest had been reading. "You have read these poems?" said he. "You know me then, for I wrote them." Okay, once again see. The poet sat down beside him, and he and Ernest talked together. So they were talking there. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. So he was wise, he was gentle, and he was kind also. The poet was impressed. So he was never had been talking to such person earlier. So he liked him, or he wanted to talk to him more. So never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. And Ernest was amazed, like poets was saying something and living images. So when poet will say something, he will make you think something else. So those image will be created in mind. So he was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen to. So it is just imagery that he was thinking of, that when the poet is saying something, the great stone face is also bending forward to listen to him. He gazed into the poet's eyes. Then he gazed into the poet's eyes. He looked into the poet's eyes. "Who are you, my gifted guest?" he asked. Then he asked, "Who are you?" Poet laid his finger on the book that Ernest had been reading. The poet pointed his finger to the book that Ernest was reading. "You have read these poems," said he. "You know me then, for I wrote them." Because you are reading these poems, so you know me, because he was the poet who wrote these poems. Again and again, Ernest examined the poet's features. He turned towards the great stone face, then back. He shook his head and sighed. So he accepted. "So why are you sad?" inquired the poet. "Because," replied Ernest, "all through life I have awaited the fulfillment of a prophecy, and when I read these poems, I hoped that it might be fulfilled in you." Okay. So he was little disappointed, because when he was reading the poem of this poet, he thought that this poet could be the person who will resemble the great stone face, and the prophecy will be fulfilled. So he hoped that it might be fulfilled in you. "You hoped," answered the poet, faintly smiling, "to find in me the likeness of the great stone face. I am not worthy to be its likeness." So I am not worthy to be its likeness means he is not that same stone face person, okay, or resembles that stone face. "And why not?" asked Ernest. He pointed to the book. "Are not these thoughts worthy?" Because his thoughts were very, very good. So you should resemble that, and the prophecy should come true, Ernest said. "So you can hear in them the distant voice of a heavenly song. But my life, dear Ernest, was not corresponded with my thoughts. I have had grand dreams, but they have been only dreams." Okay, the poet said he also had many dreams, but these all were only a dream. "Sometimes I lack faith in my own thoughts. Why then, pure seeker of the good and true, should you hope to find me in the face of the mountain?" Okay. Why then, pure seeker of the good and true, should you hope to find me on the face of the mountain? He said there is no reason to find him in the stone face. The poet spoke sadly, and his eyes were wet with tears. So too were those of Ernest. So they were sad on this. At the hour of sunset, as had long been his custom, Ernest was to speak to a group of neighbors. The poet spoke sadly, and his eyes were wet in tears. So too were those of Ernest. So both were sad, sitting sad. At the hours of sunset, as had long been his custom, Ernest was to speak to a group of neighbors in the open air. So he had some meeting, you can say, kind of meeting with a group of neighbors. Together he and the poet went to the meeting place arm in arm. So they together went to the meeting. From there could be seen a great stone face. From there they could see the stone face also, the stone face of which was on the mountain. Ernest threw a look of familiar kindness around upon his audience. Okay. So Ernest threw a look of familiar kindness around upon his audience. He began to speak to the people what was in his heart and mind. He started talking to whatever thoughts he had. His words had power because they agreed with his thoughts, and his thoughts had reality and depth because they harmonized with the life which he had always lived. So he will always speak the true, whatever the information he has gathered, he will speak upon those things. So reality, and he will speak with that power, energy and intensity that people will be happy and will like to listen to him. It was not merely breath that the preacher uttered, they were the words of life. So it was good to listen to. So comfort will be there among people after listening to him. A life of good deeds and selfless love was melted into them. So all good and kindness and good things will be melted or settled in them. The poet, as he listened, felt that the life and character of Ernest were a nobler strain of poetry than he had ever written. Okay. So the poet was also impressed with his words, that whatever he has written, Ernest is much more better than his own poetry. His eyes filled with tears, and he said to himself that never was there so worthy a sage as that mild, sweet, thoughtful face with the glory of white hair diffused about it. So he was very much impressed. He thought that there has never been such a worthy of sage. Okay, and when he compared it with Ernest, so Ernest was better than all his poems also. At a distance, but clearly to be seen, high up in the golden light of the setting sun, appeared the great stone face, with white mists around it, like the white hairs around the brow of Ernest. At that moment, Ernest's face took on an expression so grand that the poet was moved to throw his arms up and shout, "Behold, behold, Ernest is himself the likeness of the great stone face." Okay, so this is the main statement or main theme of the story. You can see the poet has said, okay, wait and behold, Ernest is himself the likeness of the great stone face. Okay, but he was unaware of it. Ernest himself was unaware of it, but the poet seen the great stone face in Ernest. Okay, so see again. At a distance, but clearly to be seen, high up in the golden light of the setting sun. So when the sun was setting down, appeared the great stone face with white mist around it. So white mists covered the great stone face around it. So the hairs will look light on the stone face as well, like the white hairs around the brow of Ernest, like the white hairs Ernest already had. So it resembled the white hairs. Okay. At that moment, Ernest's face took on an expression so grand that, and at that time also the Ernest expression was so grand, okay, that the poet was moved to throw his arms up. Then he used to raise an alarm. Okay, he raised his arm and started shouting, "Behold, behold, Ernest is himself the likeness of the great stone face." So Ernest himself is the face of the great stone face. Then all the people looked and saw that the poet said what the poet said was true. Then all the people looked and saw that what the poet said was true. Then all the people also saw that what poet is saying is true. The prophecy was fulfilled, and the prophecy was fulfilled also. But Ernest, having finished what he had to say, took the poet's arm and walked slowly homeward. Then they walked slowly towards their home, towards his home, still hoping that some wiser and better man than himself would by and by appear, bearing a resemblance to the great stone face. And they were thinking, he was thinking that, okay, they were hoping, still hoping that. So see again. But Ernest, having finished what he said, what he had to say, took the poet's arm and walked slowly homeward. So it is for Ernest. So after the prophecy was fulfilled, Ernest started walking towards his home along with the poet, and he was hoping that days after days some other wiser person may come and he may also resemble the great stone face. So while walking he was hoping this. This story is written by Nathalie Hawthorne and it is bracketed as abridged. Abridged means entire story is not covered, so the portion of it of importance is written or rewritten here in short. So abridged it is.